So we can start. We have the info.
Trustee Brady here, trustee Hallwax here, trustee Rubin here. All right.
Now, is there any public comment? All right. Hearing none. Moving on. Consideration of motion to approve.
So, back.
All in favor?
All right.
All right. Nikki, fire away.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Okay, so we have a packed agenda this evening with a few special visitors. So we'll start with the July treasurer's report and then give an update, a quick update on the CIP. And then we have an emergency funding request from Family Services. So we're going to have Stephen this evening to be talking a little bit. And we're kicking off budget season with a review of our financial policies and our draft budgets. More good news in the general fund. This fund is just continuing. All of our major general fund revenue sources are continuing to perform strong with the exception of building permits. They're slightly lagging last year, but we did issue 5 new construction in the past month. So we are still seeing that activity remain steady. It just seems that the value of the permit might be a little less. Our sales and our places for eating tax continue to do well. Our parking analysis is underway, so we're pulling historical places for eating and sales tax information for downtown businesses to try to determine if there's a correlation between the parking spaces that are reserved and that revenue. So we're still kind of pulling that information together. And then the other item of note on this slide that I would just say, our utility tax is doing really well. That's largely driven by the natural gas utility tax and the high prices that we've seen, especially earlier this year. There we go. Okay, thank you. Okay, so moving on to the water fund, our water revenue continues to lag behind last year. We had some anomalies last year. Last year was drought-like conditions, so those were some extreme revenues that we were pulling in. But we're not that far off of where we would expect to be with budgetary targets, and we still have summer usage left, so I'm very hopeful that we still might see those budgetary targets. The fund balance in the water fund will benefit this year. There's a pro and con to the delay in the water fund projects that we had to put off because of the bid results. But because those funds might be expended, obviously the fund balance will benefit from that. Moving on to sales tax, this is the first month in a long time that we've actually seen a slight decrease. So it's only 1%, it's very minimal. We're not concerned about it at this point, but I do think that sales tax is starting to level off and it's starting to be that new normal. So I don't think we're going to see those triple-digit increases month to month, month over month anymore.
Did you look at all the sources of tax and where?
Not yet. It's still going to be part of our analysis. Flat revenue, but we'll bring that back to you next month.
I just wondered.
Just like we're really driving it. And then overall, when just looking at our actual revenues, what they're coming into compared to what we're budgeting, we're projecting that the general fund might exceed its revenue budget by $886,000 this year. The water fund might exceed revenue budget by $175,000. So we still have a few months left. This could change, obviously, but certainly we're trending in a positive direction. Moving on to the other section of the report that we've added in terms of local impacts and what we're seeing. Our public safety squads are still delayed, and we have not received those yet. And our golf course has had to be very creative in trying to find repair parts. Another thing that we are having logistical issues with. To find alternative sources. I know we've been on eBay trying to buy placement parts for equipment. And then also lately with paper, we also have some issues with that. The scorecards at the golf course, they're having trouble sourcing those. In finance, we're having trouble if we were to put any inserts into the water bills. That paper is on back order as well. So very minor things, but they are part of our operation that we are experiencing locally. And then on a public works side, our raw materials and our supply parts are continuing to see increases. Looking at this globally across the organization, when we look at all the funds, both our supply and our commodity expenses are still less year to date this year than they were last year. So we're not at a point of concern, but we are still at this point of just kind of monitoring what's happening and keeping an eye on our expenses.
Has there been, from a personnel standpoint, any additional turnover that was unexpected or non-union requests for raises or things like that?
I'll be anecdotally in the finance department. We've been the lucky department to be the next public safety, the first one to really have trouble filling a position. We're on our third round of offering a job to someone, and we've watched that salary. So that's a very small example of what we've seen. In terms of other demands.
I don't know that we've seen dramatic changes. And there's definitely pressure on starting salary. There's pressure on timing, getting an offer out quickly. We've had, to Nikki's point, I mean, we went through 3 rounds for an AR coordinator. And we had offers on the table that were accepted and then pulled back at the last minute. I think their employers probably did what we would do, which is, what do we need to do to keep you? Because we don't want to go through a recruitment if we don't have to. So that's certainly been a part of it. Public safety staffing continues to be a struggle. The Public Safety Commission is doing everything they can to work as quickly as they can within the constraints of the civil service process. But I'll say that I think we're all grateful that we worked quickly to get a lateral transfer program and policy in place, because we have seen some value quickly in that. And we're one of the individuals who's being sworn in on Thursday night is a lateral from another community, and we're working on a few more. That's been helpful. But I think we'll continue to see that. And overtime in public safety is not outrageously out of control, despite the fact that we are short-staffed and there are times where we're forcing back. But as I look at those overtime numbers, they're not as frightening as I sometimes anticipate them to be. So I'm not sure if that'll change as we move through this, but hopefully as more of our offers are accepted and we onboard some new folks. The lateral program is nice because we save time. We can put people on the street sooner. Usually they're coming to us as certified police officers, but we don't have to send them to the police academy. That does save us some time. We've got to get them in the fire academies, but we can get them on the street right away, which isn't always the case with a new hire. So that's helped. But it's going to continue to be a hyper-competitive environment, one that we really haven't experienced in the public sector in a very long time.
Do you mind giving brand new hire has to go through training? That looks like versus someone comes from another department, that looks like what? What are those two things look like again?
If we hire somebody with no experience whatsoever, and they go to the police academy first, the police academy is 16 weeks, so that's 4 months. Then they do 3 months of FTO, so that's 7 months. So it's at least 7 months till they can go out on their own. And even after that, then they have additional training for evidence technician, juvenile officer, things like that that they have to do. So realistically, it's a year to get their basic police training done.
Right.
And then if we send them to a fire academy, then that second year is all fire related. So it takes us, that's why we have a 2-year probationary period rather than 1, because we have to do a lot before we can determine whether or not somebody really can make it with us or not. So by hiring a lateral, it saves us at least 1 year at the front.
Right.
Because when we hire a lateral, they're in the FDO program for 3 to 4 weeks. basically, because they already know how to be a police officer, they just have to learn how to do our ways with Cook County and our record system. So, it saves us 7 months right off the bat, and probably more. But the other skills they bring along.
What's the impact with pension?
They start out as a tier 2 pensioner, but they can bring their years with them, right?
It depends on where they're coming from. So actually, our actuary here, but if they're coming from Chicago, they cannot transfer in service credit. So they start over on a tier 2 pension, which is a lesser level of benefit. If they're a lateral transfer from another community, it's the same article fund under the law, they can transfer that service credit in. But the fund from which they are transferring service credit from has to make us whole. So there's a calculation that are actually.
Yeah, it's a combination. There's a statutory amount that the prior fund has to transfer over. And so let's just say, when they come here, the value of their benefit is $100,000. The other fund, the prior fund, may have to transfer $70,000. And then in order for all of the service to come, the member has to make up the difference. So the member has to come out of pocket for $30,000 in that case for all of the service. If they say, well, I can't afford that, then 70 of the 100, so 7/10 or 70% of their service would transfer. So it is, they are required to pay to cover the cost of their pension when they first transfer.
From a demographic perspective, certainly if we're hiring more tier 1 employees and our contribution, our accrued liability goes down. So you can still, I guess that would delay kind of that flip from tier 1 to tier 2. But at least they would make us whole for that liability that they purchased.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, thank you. So I'm going to turn it over to Stella for the golf club. Okay.
July was a good month. We're 1,000 rounds over budget. Year to date, we're 2,000 rounds over budget. We did have a slow start in the spring, so that's why we're now a little bit farther ahead than we were last year. But overall, a very strong July. We're seeing right now a lot of overflow from Winnetka. They closed their par 3 course, and if you don't know or not, they are closing their 18-hole course for the next 2 years as part of the village stormwater project. So we do anticipate obviously seeing a lot of great for us. Special events, we had Play for Pink events in July in conjunction with our Ladies League, and we raised almost $5,000 of that charity. We do work with breast cancer research, so we're happy with that. We had an Illinois Junior Golf Association tournament by us, so we had 100 juniors who were really top-notch players from around the area come out and play that event for them. So that has more exposure with our kids. Friends of the Glencoe Golf Club, we have a new board member. Alice Goodman has joined our board. If you're not familiar with the Goodman family, they're very philanthropic and civic-minded. They've supported Ryder Skater quite a bit. Alice has been on the Chicago Botanic Garden Board quite some time. So he's a firecracker, bringing a lot of energy to the board, has some good ideas and bringing a lot of good energy to that board. And right now, the funds current balance is $309,000.
Moving on. Let's go over to Assistant Finance Director Margaret Morris for our CIP update.
Good evening, Finance Committee members. This evening I'll be presenting the August CIP update. Your schedules can be found in your packet on pages 57 and 58 for the monthly update, and quarterly update on page 59. Also, if you're looking at the schedules, the highlights of changes are in blue. The PW Administrative Vehicle number 7 that was approved by the Board of Trustees in December of 21 is finally arriving in September of 22. That's good news. estimated completion date for the lagoon transition water main project that was just approved by the board in July has been updated to be completed in November of 22. And the water plant replacement of pumps and motor high lifts project is on the village board agenda for consideration on Thursday for the August board meeting, and then estimated to be completed in December of 22. If you have any questions, staff's available to answer.
Okay. Right along. So included in your packet is an extensive request for emergency funding from the Administrative Glencoe. We're joined by Executive Director.
Hi guys, I'm Christina, I'm the Executive Director of Human Service upstairs. Since the July 4 attack in Highland Park, my team has been working very closely with community partners to provide free mental health services to those affected by the mass shooting. Starting on July the 4th, Emily Mizell, our senior social worker, she was on site working with the Highland Park Police Department, of course, in partnership with our own Glencoe Public Safety, providing, I'm going to force her to go home, providing around the clock care and working with the FBI and police to reunite families, identify individuals, provide assistance as a victim advocate. It's a really hard task for Emily. So that was day one. On day 2, we immediately started offering free mental health services. And we do have a new clinician on board who is actually bilingual in Spanish, which has been very helpful, especially for our workforce in Glencoe. And so that's a change from our original menu of services. We charge for services, we do offer sliding scale, we do have scholarships, we do bill insurance. But what I wanted to make sure is that payment was not a barrier to providing any type of mental health care. So ongoing, since July 5th, we've been offering every week several free drop-in clinics. We even have them here at Village Hall, Central School, the Park District, Shalom. And basically it requires no appointment necessary, so you can drop in and speak immediately to a counselor. We've also been offering ongoing traditional therapy where we assign you to a therapist. So my request, and this is in conjunction with other requests to other government agencies, other funders, including individual donors, New Career Township also recently funded us, is to provide ongoing care through the remainder of the calendar year. And there's a proposal in your packet where you can see what I've outlined to offer our Glencoe community members and workforce, including drop-in clinics. We'll continue to offer those throughout Glencoe several times a week. Crisis response, we're estimating that Emily will spend approximately 5 hours per week. Unfortunately, things keep piling on, and I was sharing with Bill earlier that the shooting at Six Flags the other day, unfortunately, which just compounded the issue because we have teenagers who were at the Highland Park shooting. They were at Six Flags hiding, and now they're going back to school. And keep in mind, these are all brand new clients for us. What we're seeing is most of them are uninsured. A lot of them are workforce, which is a huge increase for us. And most of these individuals have never received any type of mental health services. We've had moms frantically calling us at night. I'm no workaholic that I pick up my phone and I'm constantly answering our Facebook messages because they're just wanting to get help. So that's the crisis response. Follow-up counseling, traditional one-on-one therapy sessions, ongoing therapy. We're offering up to 4 free sessions. With this grant, we would continue to offer free sessions through the end of the calendar year. Workplace processing, I know that our police social worker, Brian, has done a couple of debriefings with our own public safety department. We're also working with quite a few other employers in the area. As you can imagine, if their own teams, and one in particular, North Suburban Legal Aid, they do a lot of work in Glencoe and in the township. A lot of their staff members were at the parade, and so they had to deal with their own trauma before they can then continue and treat their own clients. Parent support groups and educator support groups. This is something done in conjunction, especially with Dr. Wang and Central School, District 35 to offer in English and in Spanish. And then also support groups for kids. This would be done in conjunction with the Park District. Offering, as you can imagine, going back to school, there's a lot of fear and there's a great letter that came out with Chief Lewandowski and Dr. Wang on, about returning back to school and just safety and just feeling that sense of people are scared right now. And the cycle ad presentations for the community. This goes also in partnership with the Village and District 35 of the See Something, Say Something campaign. So this is doing a lot of education for these red flags and these different types of internet groups where parents are now calling us saying, saw this on my kid's iPad. What does this mean? What like somebody do this the end? And we're like, oh my gosh, like this is bad. Like this is so that's kind of it, in a nutshell, basically hiding what our community members need, whether they're residents or workforce, free of charge, and just reducing any barriers from paying wage, the ability to pay, and then also just even transportation. We're piloting this telehealth drop-in sessions to be able, if a lot of people have childcare issues and back to school things get really crazy for people with young kids. Well, fine, go online and schedule, and you can drop in for an hour session via our platform. So the request I submitted was for $30,589, and there's just a very basic budget in there. And that would cover at a minimum 100 residents of Glencoe. I'm expecting it to cover many more with those groups of educators and parents. But this is truly just for Glencoe. The new Career Township money that I was just awarded about a week ago, that would cover the remainder of the township excluding Glencoe. I've requested funds from other townships to cover Moraine Township, Highland Park residents, Lake County. I submitted grants to DHS, to J.D. Pritzker's office, and I'm working with a lobbyist to kind of navigate some of those, unknown territory right now with the funding streams. But this is just one piece of it. I really want to be able to provide this ongoing trauma response care. And hopefully, this is a once in a lifetime for me to go through. So it's just a very special request to get us through the end of this year.
How many people serve
And then
related to this?
and we now serve almost 100 individuals. And we have our brand new clinician that started on July 1. Her caseload is already at capacity. So these drop-in clinics, we thought, well, maybe people will come 1 or 2 times. For new therapy recipients, and that will be it. But what we're finding is people are signing up for ongoing care. So we're kind of at that point where now I'm trying to decide to hire an intake specialist to come to that, to hire another clinician. We're getting very creative of how we serve, but we don't have a wait list. So if someone calls us, someone called today as I was upstairs preparing for this, and she's able to meet with a clinician tomorrow afternoon. So that's one of the things that we have the capacity, we have the staff, offering both English and Spanish services.
So just relative to tonight, this is really just an opportunity for Christina to talk with the finance committee. The full board will consider the request on Thursday night. There's a resolution on the agenda for discussion. Christina will be back for that meeting too. We figured since there's a finance committee meeting, there'd be value in the ability to have her share some information with you, answer questions that you may have, and then ultimately consider it on Thursday night.
Do people in Glencoe know? I mean, I guess how many people know that this is available?
All of our marketing efforts, the Village has done a really great job. Sammy has been helping us market. in the village newsletters, on social media, and the township partners, all of our clergy partners, and then our own social media. So we've been getting a very high response, and it's a good thing, but it's also, you know, it's a little scary what the response has been. To the point where yesterday we got a call from Makina, Illinois, saying, I have a friend in Highland Park and they said you're offering such great services. And I said, well, you know, let us point you in the direction closer to where you live. But it's certainly, we're getting our name out there. We're on all of the official Highland Park service provider list, the governor's list, Lake County Office of Emergency Management. So our name is getting out there. But I really have to credit, you know, those team honestly for that's the biggest push that we're getting.
That's a good question. When people coming for repeat visits, is Glencoe County Services set up to provide more emergency inflow time? Like, you're not supposed to be someone's therapist that's coming once a week for a year, right? That's not what you're designed for. Or are you? I don't know.
Oh, yeah, no, it definitely is.
Okay, so then effectively now it's my question then is, does this expand with mental health being as bad as it is?
So this would basically cover if we have the same, similar traffic for the remainder of the calendar year through December 31st. As you know, though, trauma is triggered, especially children. We have kids that are afraid they break camp and they come back and they heard of what happened, and now they're scared to go to school. I've had adults even live in the community, work in the community, and have to keep their jobs because of children who had underlying issues and triggered. So I'm hoping that this will be enough. I think long term, I know that, you know, you guys already gave us a generous grant this year for our general operating our traditional mental health services. I think it's something that we would need to revisit, you know, next calendar year, and every fiscal year is a little different than ours. But I'm hopeful that this will work, especially with leveraging other resources. And working with individual donors. We have a golf outing coming up in a couple of weeks where we're at capacity already. So I'm trying to be very careful not to overburden any of our donors or funders. Be very respectful of that.
I would just add that I've already told Christina, we've been on a few calls together with legislators that wherever the village can lend our support for grant applications and funding requests at the state and federal level, we will certainly do so. President Rowan and I will see some of our local state legislators next week. That'll be something that we reinforce with them, the importance of continuing to have state dollars flowing toward these services as well. And so we'll continue those efforts on the village's behalf in partnership with FSG. I would just add, I think a comment that I'm continuing to hear throughout the community is how grateful people are for the services that FSG is providing. Certainly here in Glencoe, but also overlap into Highland Park assisting. There are not as many social service agencies that have jumped in at the level that FSG has in response to this. I think Highland Park and Glencoe's connectedness was underscored in this tragedy, and there's a lot of overlap, faith communities, friends between the two communities that are struggling with it. And I think FSG has certainly provided a tremendous amount of resources already. But again, that's why, you know, we're committed to continuing to work with the state legislators too. And if there's letters of support, things like that, that FSG needs, we're ready to jump in from that standpoint too.
And we've been working, you know, very closely with public safety departments, especially Emily and, you know, several of the lieutenants. We also want to make sure that we're providing intervention. Don't want those 911 calls to come out where something is being triggered and it turns into some sort of domestic violent dispute, or where a child or an adult attempts to harm themselves. So, the therapeutic interventions are the best way for us to go, because we would rather treat the issue and provide ongoing care instead of public safety having to deal with some. Right.
And part of the earlier. Pretty easy one, and I think when you're talking to state legislators, mentioning that we are.
Yeah, pretty early.
Yeah.
Thank you for all this.
No, big deal. It's, we can do what we do without the village support, so.
Thank you, Christine.
Now we're on the.
Topic 12. So included in your packet are red line financial policy. Been through this before. You remember we do this as part of the budget process every year. We take a look at our policies, we dust them off and any updates. So I've outlined here and in the memo the changes that staff is recommending from a fund balance policy standpoint. We talked last year to kind of creep up that general fund balance target. We talked about moving it up 1% per year, kind of ease ourselves into that 25% target. So this year would be moving us to 17%. The next one's a little tougher. The CPI came out, and I'm sure you're all super familiar with it by now, that it's at a 40-year high. December over December, it was a 7% increase, which means that the allowable increase under PTEL is at the maximum for the first time since I've been doing this.
Since PTEL was established, I believe.
Yes. So that means that our property tax levy could increase by 5%. Village's past practice has always been to levy at the max of PTEL. We haven't always needed that, but we have moved forward with that, with the understanding that when the next year comes, we can't recoup that amount.
Do it or lose it.
Right. So this is going to be a question before you. If you'd like to discuss it tonight, you can. If you need more information, we can talk about it when we start looking at the financial forecast and see where the numbers lie. But this is going to be a question, and a rather big one, of how we build the budget, of whether or not we're going to go with a 5% increase in the property tax levy, or we're going to look at something less.
I was gonna say, all we've been hearing about is how much more expensive it is. Whether it's hiring a new person, keeping people, heaven forbid you want to put a pipe in the ground, try to buy a vehicle. This isn't going to change for a while. And the real numbers could well be higher than 5%. Forget what the headline number is, or the particular CPI that people use. I realize that different versions and different people and different entities are affected differently. But lots of the costs that I've been hearing about, which are huge, are up by a lot more than that. I think we would put ourselves at a great disadvantage if we didn't just stay with our current policy. It would only be so great that we actually built up reserves. We're like, oh, no. This year, we're not doing our 3% or 2% or whatever. We don't need it. We're not there. Not close.
The one thing I would also just add to what Nikki's already shared is the village always retains the option to abate at the end of the year. And that can always be a backstop that the board could use as a tool. And if revenues are much stronger, or those resources aren't needed for something else, then admittedly we talk about capital a lot. We've got a $58 million CIP, not including some other big things that are out there. There's always going to be we're always going to be able to tell you that there's a need for capital investment. So those dollars may be there, and may be necessary for something, but you always have the ability to abate, at the end of the year. So I just remind you of that fact as well.
What would be our discussion on abating? Did we talk specifically about it? Or did we, I don't remember.
Too. So we haven't for a while, before we issued water revenue bonds, we hadn't been abating for a while. Yes, primarily.
Increases were so small.
And that actually kind of goes, your question goes kind of nicely with the next point is, since we issued water bond, it was 2 years ago, 3 years ago, gosh, they all pushed together, 3 years ago.
Yeah.
That's right.
Almost 3 years
Year
ago.
of COVID.
It was right at the beginning of COVID.
2020.
Yeah.
So with the concept that we're issuing bonds that should be backed by water revenue. So there really should be no reason why we would have to levy for that debt. So we do abate that every year. And at a minimum, that would be what we're recommending again going forward. You can always abate other general obligation bond debt service if you want. So like to Phil's point,
Abating, can we just say, let's abate it and do that? I mean, it's just totally discretionary.
the village board has the power to do it. There's usually some methodology that you use to
Yeah,
get
let's
there.
do it.
Yeah.
Right.
Whether you have, an increased revenue one year, and there's no obligation. If you abate 1 year, you don't have to do it the following, or you can do it every year, or you can do none of the years.
Right.
So that's a tool that we have in our toolbox, so that's something to look at, what those dollars would be. I think the other conversation that we had with abatement was the 2019 limited tax bonds that we issued. That debt payment is about $198,000 a year. And every year we were going to kind of evaluate that and say, should we abate that? Should we let that fly through? But we could certainly do that with any of the general obligation funds. So, and perhaps one of the things that we could do is bring a couple of scenarios along with the financial forecast, to see what it would look like with the different increases in the property tax levy and what the numbers would flow through the next 5 years.
And I mean, we're seeing general fund balance above what we expected this year, but all the inflation that we've seen still remain, and I think that's fair.
And I would underscore, we continue to have capital investment. I think
And that's one of the areas that's already.
right. And I think, we've started having conversations relative to debt versus cash. At what level do we perhaps begin to use fund balance for some of that capital investment rather than new debt? And I think we're getting to a place where we're much more comfortable with our reserves than we ever were before. And it gives us the opportunity to have that conversation with you all relative to the future. And I think that'll come through the financial forecast discussions, CIP discussions later this fall. But we have options that frankly we didn't have in the past. So.
So those two kind of go together, the property tax ones. Management fees, we still on our radar, we still want to make sure that these are reasonable. That's going to be pending further analysis, and then the limited tax debt also kind of goes with that property tax.
The management fees, so there are two of them, right? There's one from water theoretically, and there's one from the golf club theoretically. Is there, and I don't remember where we came out. And I realize it's all one fund and another fund, your left pocket. But that said, have we actually paid from one fund to another the management fees? We did for the water fund? Have we done that?
We've done it from the golf fund as well.
Okay.
So we've done both.
Not the historical, but the current.
Correct. Yes,
Yeah.
that's couple of years.
Okay.
We just want to make sure that if we're going to go forward with that, that it's sustainable. So that it makes sense.
Those transfers typically happen at the end of the fiscal year, right?
Can we forgive the debt? I don't know.
We are doing it in over 10 years.
Over 10 years.
So at the end of the year, we make one entry.
Yeah, right.
That way it doesn't kind of hit the general fund. Okay, so that's the next step. Fees and charges for services. We are expanding our annual fee survey this year, to include additional communities that we have to talk to and pass, and also trying to focus on fees that maybe we haven't thought of or other communities have. So we've actually already started that with this for us. And then just like we did last year, we'll be looking at the water rate again to just care of have the water rate study that should be a certain percentage, but now that we have the new smart meter technology, that would still make sense. So we'll be looking at that as well.
And we did drop that a bit from where we
This year.
were going.
Yeah.
That's one of the ones we did debate, so we dropped the rate a little bit. From where we were going.
Right,
Right.
so to some degree, because the American Rescue Plan Act resources that we received, and because revenues came in very strongly last year.
Yeah.
So what we'll have to include in the analysis this year is now where the water grid results are coming in, they like to be back to capital. Will be going forward. Kind of with the same idea that we don't want to have any large crazy increases and try and smooth that over time. Other policies that are potential sources of revenue, we still have the IRMA and IPPC surplus. Those are funds that we can use for whatever we need. We did just buy a drone. Is that on this?
It should be in this check.
We decided to stop renting.
Yeah.
So Thursday evening, spoiler alert, in the village board meeting agenda is the purchase of a drone. And we are recommending from a safety perspective, funding some of that from the IRMA surplus. But there was 1.1 million, this is making a tiny event, so we still have more than $1 million in that reserve. What we've done in past years is use a portion of that to be part of our risk management premium, so that might be something to look at again this year.
And those dollar amounts are included in our general fund balance. When we're thinking about what the reported amount is, right?
They are not, because we don't hold it.
Or they were reported in something. I remember reading, you said they're included the financial forecast in terms of what our reserves, right? We include that number, so we can look at that number. What do we think our reserves are going to be? Because that's like cash.
Yes.
It is exactly like cash. We have it's unrestricted. The village can use it for any purpose that it chooses.
But it's not sitting in that.
So it goes up every year. I mean, we want to talk about our policy towards that. So it's, when I started, it was probably $500,000. Now we're
And
seems like it's-
we've drawn down from it several times since you've been on the board.
Yeah.
For not insignificant purchases, all the security upgrades in the village hall and public work building, cameras in the downtown, a series of other things. We probably spent $300,000 out of that fund in the last 7 years.
And what, is there any reason to even have a balance? So then, because, if it's not a balance there, then it is a balance.
The only reason you might want to keep the reserve balance there would be as a savings account for large claims, because our deductible is still at $50,000. We could look at decreasing the deductible again, which would increase our premium a little bit, but that would cover a little bit more, and then we haven't as much of a need for that reserve.
But even each year, maybe talking about how much our balance goes up and what should be use of that increase, and maybe putting that in the policy, something to let's talk about it every year, because we've saved while pulling money out, we still saved another $2.5 million that we haven't necessarily needed, but we do. I think about it a little bit. Here and keep it. I think
That money's invested, right? What's been the historical rate of return versus.
It's not, yeah, it's not dramatically different.
So there's no advantage to people.
They have, they're technically not a government agency, so they could invest in some things that we couldn't, they typically don't. Because
They're pretty
They have a
prudent
lot of-
about it, yeah.
they have a lot of incentives to preserve that.
Yeah.
principle.
Yeah. I mean, the policy at this point stipulates that we will maintain at least $300,000 in that fund. And we're at 1.1 at this, I mean, and we'll get an updated number from, that was at the end of last fiscal year. We'll get an updated number from Irma when we get to the financial forecast. I would say, you know, this is, we won't have it yet.
But we
Okay.
can predict.
Okay. We may want to talk about how to use those dollars, if there's specific uses that the board may have a preference on. Like I said, we've used them in the past, and I don't think it's codified in the policy, but we've kind of had an unwritten rule that we focus on safety and perhaps things that might limit our future insurance liability. When we've reinvested those funds and things that we've purchased or improved. But there's no magic to that.
What do we pay?
Across all funds.
Across all funds.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that would include the golf fund and the water.
I think the general fund's like 380, somewhere in that neighborhood.
I mean, I'd be in favor of bringing it back. Love to all of that, but, and thinking about, and each year, from there, each year is rolling it back into the premium. And not,
Pay the premium
and then-
every year.
and then, yeah, and keeping some cushion for full insurance for large claims. Because it's really been, every year we sort of go, we've got more money in there. We don't really do anything.
Would you guys find any value in us kicking the tires on dropping the deductible again?
Not really reduced or balanced. It's
No.
really just a question of.
It's more, I think it may be
Where-
worth rebalancing it out against our experience and how things have gone. When we changed it, if you remember, from 100 to 50, we were finding that
At that level.
we were very seldomly hitting $100,000 in the deductible claim. And so we were self-funding most every claim at that point. We had 2 or 3 that were over $100,000. I think we're probably still not all that many claims that are over 50,000. So it may be worth, and we can work through that, just talk it through with you guys. Again, we may not make that change, but it's probably worth knowing whether there's any value in it.
Yeah, just the increased premium cost of that, if we drop it to 25, which would be save. But it's always been something I think it's something. Time of
Yeah, that's why I brought up specifically the fact that when we talk about the reserve number though, that we're discussing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's, you know, it's not like it's a hidden asset or anything. So,
Okay, donation policy. So we talked at length about this in earlier this year in March. So the whole thing is redlined. It's being incorporated into the financial policies. And we actually have our first donation that meets the policy guidelines to send to you this evening. So our public safety department has received a donation that meets the criteria of the guidelines. So I'll turn it over to the chief.
This was kind of an unusual donation that we received. Back in July, we needed a new refrigerator for our public safety station. So we wanted to add electronics and we usually buy all of our appliances over the years from them. And we negotiated a price when my lieutenants did with the salesperson, and we agreed to purchase the refrigerator. The owners of that live in Glencoe. They're very pro police and fire. They like to give breaks to law enforcement and fire personnel and fire departments as well. So, after negotiating the price and agreeing to the purchase and everything, the owner who lives in town got involved and he wanted to donate the refrigerator for free. In the past, we offered that when we bought other smaller appliances, and I said, no, we really shouldn't be doing that. So this time, after everything was said and done, they sent us an invoice for $5 for a $1,400. So, right. So it's, again, it's a unique situation because usually they charge us, a fair market price and they take off 20% or whatever. This time, maybe because of the environment that we're living in, he really wanted to go above and beyond. So, again, just the fact that it turned out the way it did and it fits the policy, we wanted to bring it to you tonight so you can review it and be aware of it. More than anything else, but it's, when you see an invoice for a refrigerator for $5, you have to wonder what's going on.
Really scrap the refrigerator.
The donors do meet the criteria. They don't meet any of the criteria from a prohibited source. But the value of the refrigerator is obviously over $1,000, so it does require us to bring it to you for ship.
We should say thank you very much. Yep.
It is a bit after the fact. Normally, given the way the policy is structured, this is a conversation we would have before, but as the chief mentioned, it was installed. And then the invoice was received because they typically invoice us after installation. So made it a little more complicated at that point. So again, we wanted to make sure we made it clear to all of you that we've got the policy in place and we're adhering to it as best as we can.
It was a pleasant surprise, but a little after the fact.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Okay, so moving on, we're joined by Jason Franken this evening. Our last policy that we're looking at updating is our pension funding policy. So
Before we get to that, just so I get the first one, I didn't know if we were gonna talk. So it's quite, this year is a perfect example of our fund balance. So do we have adequate fund balance? If we do not get property tax. So, did you guys think is 25% covering it if we really did go through something where we didn't get it for 6 months or 8 months? And we're in the midst of some other thing where our sales tax is really do we need to address this 25% actually?
okay.
I mean,
I mean, 6 months is being conservative, but maybe that's too conservative.
Well, it may be, an installment of the property tax, if we want to use something that is a kind of a rational, could happen, situation that, what we're seeing this year, I think what we mentioned last month is that we're going to see delays next year by a couple of months at least from when those typical disbursements take place. So we'll get the disbursement in December this year instead of September and October. Next year, we'll get it in May rather than March. So we will be okay, but it's kind of sliding, and then hopefully it swings back to that March, September disbursement. But maybe we look at that as
That's probably, I think, where we're at. From a typical government standard, a quarter of the year has been generally appropriate if your primary tax source is property taxes, because ironically, it's considered very reliable. If we're in a committee or a community where I came from, we were largely sales tax and we were required to maintain 75% fund balance. To maintain the credit rating. So it kind of depends on the reliability. I think to Phil's point, where we are today, not saying confidently that we could rely on property taxes being timely. 6 months is at least, it's a good place to start. And I think we flush that out with the financial forecast and see if it's something that we can maintain. And that would guide our budget process a little bit. If we want to look at raising that a little bit higher.
Yeah, because
I mean, this is the first time this has happened, so I don't know that we want to base our policy on a single year, but.
how long have you lived in Cook County? Lately.
Well, it's the first time it happened in the last decade.
Yeah, before then,
Before that, it was just unreliable.
Sure.
You would get it, but you weren't really sure when.
But we do get 2 payments in a
You
year,
would,
so,
but you couldn't rely on it as,
I mean, this is the
Predictably.
first year we were only potentially gonna get 1 payment.
where I think it becomes a concern, and I think it's the second installment that concerns me more than the first, because the second installment has a significant debt component. It's when we start to transfer to the pension funds. There's a higher output from the general fund or from fund balance at the end of the fiscal year than at the beginning. So I think that's where this one is, to your point, perhaps less of a typical scenario of a bad situation. But we may want to think about, and we can play around with a few different models to talk about it. It's hard to talk about it in the abstract.
No, I know, so maybe thinking about it.
Yeah.
What,
If we needed 3 months of operating expenditures, what would that look like? If we needed 4 months, 5 months, 6 months, and maybe,
and a debt service payment would otherwise be late.
right,
That is,
Which is a huge problem.
more critical than
yes,
the rest of it.
that would be a huge,
Well, you're
huge
right.
measure. Yeah. And your pension contributions.
Yeah.
Because you pay hard for that with the next audit and
The intercept
Right.
from the comptroller's office.
yes, yes.
They would just take our revenue.
I think we can play around with a few different scenarios.
Because that'll fit nicely in the financial forecast.
So then we would also have 3 payments the following year, so then you're.
Potentially, yeah.
Right, hopefully you always catch up the question. Avoiding the problems that some of the people in Cook County are going through right now, where they have to take emergency loans from the county.
Yeah, I don't think it's been a lot of it.
Yeah. That's,
No, that was a
That's
good
good,
question.
yeah.
Okay, so this is our last one. Aside from any other questions. Something that we had kind of talked about when we presented the actuarial report, which maybe he's brought extra copies in case you would like
Stole
one.
yours on eBay.
One of the things that we had talked about was potentially looking at updating the mortality tables and our interest rate assumption now that we're in a consolidated environment and we're getting a little bit out of date on the mortality tables that we're using. So I've asked Jason to come to talk to those 2 points.
And thank you for sitting through all of the.
No problem.
Okay, so just a little background. So as you all are aware, the police, there's a process in place to consolidate all of the assets for the police pension plan. Same process is going through, on the fire side, there's going to be 2 separate pension investment funds where all the investments are pooled together. Fire is basically has all the data or all the assets from all the fire funds from across the state. Police is a little bit behind them. So they're in the process of doing that now. The big benefit of that is, economy of scale, you get lower expenses, all that. They can invest in things that the smaller funds couldn't invest in. And so at least in theory, we can expect a higher rate of return. As part of this consolidation process, we are working with the consolidated fund. They performed an experience study earlier this year. And what that was is we've collected data from all of the funds throughout the state, and we created new tables that are used in the actuarial valuation. New tables for retirements, for disability, for termination,
salary increases, all of the assumptions that are being used. The investment return assumption is one that's a source of difficulty for the fund. They have, I guess, for the consolidated fund, one of the things that was written into the statute is that the adoption of any actuarial assumptions requires a supermajority or six votes. There's 5, I'll say, member / retiree people on the board and 4 municipal representatives. So there needs to be at least one person who agrees with quote unquote the other side to adopt these assumptions. Well, they have not been able to reach an agreement on the investment return assumption. One side is saying 6 3/4, the other side is saying 7, and there's been some pretty bright lines drawn, and nobody seems to want to compromise and meet in the middle. So that's an ongoing debate, been going on for 6 months, 7 months. So they have not set an assumption that they think that will be used in their actuarial evaluations. And so how this all relates to you is, many of the assumptions that we use have been based on prior experience studies. In those cases, though, it was done by the Department of Insurance, but as part of this legislation, the Department of Insurance has transferred all of those responsibilities to the consolidated fund. So as part of our next evaluation, we're going to recommend several changes, not just the two that are on the board. Many of them are, I will say, practically immaterial. So like disability, termination, and retirement, your funding policy, essentially points to the experience study. So I think based on what's in the funding policy, we would expect to adopt those over, if I look at disability, termination, retirement, and the salary increases, those 4, it's basically increases your fund ratio by about 0.5%, and your contribution actually goes up by about $10,000 to $15,000. So very, very little impact for those 4 changes. The payroll growth assumption, that's one that is specified in your funding policy. We're marching down by 25 basis points per year we're at 3.25 now to 2.5%. And each 25 basis point step that we take increases your contribution requirement by $36,000. So over the next 3 years, it's about $120,000 approximately increase. And this assumption, we've talked about this at length before, but this removes some of that backloading. It pays more now, so you generate more investment income and lowers your long-term contribution requirement. So I think for that one, we would expect us to stay on track. Just to give you an idea, the police fund did adopt a 3% payroll growth assumption, so your target's a little bit lower than that. But to me, that's it's the preferred position from my perspective, because you are it's 50 basis points less, so it's not terribly out of line with what the consolidated fund is using, but it is eliminating reducing your long-term obligation by having it slightly lower. So that leaves the final 2 assumptions up there that are on the board. The mortality table. We just changed this somewhat recently because there was a new mortality table that was released in 2019. And that it's a public safety specific table. They adopted the same exact table as what we have that we've been using. There are future adjustments to those tables, how mortality is going to change in the future. And so their future adjustments are slightly less conservative than ours. But frankly, it's almost a non-event. It decreases the contribution by $7,500, and it increases your funding ratio by 0.3% by just simply changing the adjustment table that's being used. So again, to me, all these things other than the payroll growth there's $7,500 increase, a $10,000 or $7,500 decrease, a $10,000 decrease. And 24, so $24,000 increase. So a lot of these things are just frankly offsetting. And so the payroll growth, that is a little more, it increases by $36,000 per year. So then the last item, and that's the interest rate, it's the one that has the most impact. We are currently using 6.5%. And so as I mentioned, the consolidated fund is debating between 6 3/4 and 7%. The fire fund actually adopted 7.125, so a little bit higher. So the question becomes, do you want to keep your assumption of 6.5%, or do we raise it to reflect, what we expect will be over the long term higher investment returns? And I just looked at, if we lowered it or increased it, from 6.5 to 6 3/4, it would lower your annual contribution requirement by about $175,000. So there is, I think there's justification. I think the expectation based on current assumptions is that the fund would earn a little slightly less than 7%. Obviously, that changes over time, but where we are today, close to 7% is the expectation. So if you wanted to increase it from 6.5, I probably would limit it to 6 3/4. And that, like I said, does decrease the contribution by about $175,000. On the other hand, if you chose to leave it alone, that does lower the bar each year, so it's easier to achieve. And I mean, it's just being slightly more conservative than having a 6.35 or 6.5, sorry, 6.75% assumption. So I'm completely comfortable leaving it 6.5 or increasing it to 6 3/4. It just really comes down to you as a committee where your comfort level is. And would you prefer to pay more now and reduce your long-term obligation, or get a little bit of a break? You're still within a reasonable range, but then you would pay slightly more over time.
What's the incentive of being an outlier relative to whatever the consolidated? I don't know.
The consolidated fund.
Yeah, what they're proposing. I mean, now that we consolidated everything, isn't the idea that we're all sort of operating with the same assumptions?
Yes, so all the assets are going to be, they're going to be earning, but the justification for having something less is, well, maybe we want to be, more conservative. Historically, the state of Illinois has been fairly aggressive with pension and, pension funding, and have historically have relied too much on contributions that are going to be down the road. That pension ramp. They've taken the gamble that, well, in 30 years from now, we're going to have twice as much as we have for pension funds today, and so we can defer contributions. And so being, maybe your philosophy is just different than that, and we want to be a little more conservative than what the consolidated funds do. That would be the justification. There's no requirement that you do that, but I've said often that I prefer that each community makes their own decisions on how they're going to fund the plan, because if you follow what comes out of Springfield, more times than not, you're going to end up in trouble. And not saying that 6.5, the difference between 6.5 and 6 3/4 is going to get you in trouble. But like I said, it is slightly more conservative. Just like on the funding policy, you've adopted a 15-year approach to your amortization. Meanwhile, in Springfield, we're looking to push it back to, from the 20 years we are, 19, 20 years we are now to 30 or more years. And so having your own philosophy and implementing your own policies, I think is best for the community and, the pensioners.
Maybe you can't answer this. What's the risk that no good deed goes unpunished? And then we decide to be conservative and pay more. And down the road, somebody looks and says, we've got to rebalance the have and have not, therefore. Thank you.
Yeah, well, but
But that's where I was going to, where we're all using the same.
Yeah, no, that, I cannot say that would not happen, but the way it's set up, your assets, it's just like a mutual fund. You have your shares of the overall pot, and those are yours, so they cannot be transferred to other communities. And so, at least in theory, there's zero chance of that happening. However, I know there are funds who are on the brink of running out of money. And what happens when they run out of money? And those communities are very poor communities. They don't, they have retirees that are getting paid $4 million a year, and the city doesn't have $4 million a year. How is that going to play out? It would, just thinking about it, having a $8 billion pool of money set aside, even though it's not for those specific people, I can't say that would never happen. I'd say, well, we're going to just borrow to pay these guys. I can't say that it would never happen. It shouldn't happen. It's not set up to happen that way. But I can't tell you that there's 0% probability.
I don't know that we'd know what would happen until something like that actually happens, because at that point in time, they're gonna have to break their rules to dip into other funds, or there's gonna have to be a legislative change, or there's gonna have to be something else that takes place. And it will happen at some point.
And it's not very far
where
to
the
happen.
question will be called, but it is not structured today for those dollars to be taken from elsewhere. So I think, again, until there's the question called on the carpet of what are you gonna do? You're gonna default, or are you going to dip in somewhere else, or is there gonna be, does the state come in and rescue that component of the fund? It's hard to know. So it's even harder to kind of build a funding mechanism for something that you have no idea.
So
How
your
it
point,
will
if we're overfunded, we could get dinged for that.
I'm just thinking,
I don't know that we'll ever be over.
Let's say that we're funded at a higher percentage,
That's
and we
something
can
else.
dip in. And we can dip into the people that have a higher percent, right? Is that the layman's?
That could happen.
But who owes the money?
To the retiree, the cities.
The individual.
Not the fund.
Not the fund.
Not the fund. So if they steal your money, it's still stealing.
We can.
That's-
We would have the ability to do.
Same way we can take someone's land, but we have to pay for it.
Right.
Well, what I'm wondering is,
There are rules beyond
could the government decree, not that they're gonna take our money, because the government decree that we just going forward need to pay more. So we paid early, so we don't have to pay more. But then it runs into trouble, and they look and they see Glencoe, they're pretty rich. They should be paying more than they think they should pay. If we're gonna set that number at what, if they had just followed our rules.
I would be more concerned about that happening if the pension funds were structured differently. If we were talking about an IMRF style, everybody
Is this stuff
That's
more
not
related
what it
to that?
well, I don't think
That's
the likelihood of
my
that
whole
happening is high.
Not zero.
I don't think the likelihood of getting to an IMRF style fund with police or fire is likely in any of our lifetimes. Just simply knowing how complicated it was to get to this place legislatively. And you can disagree, maybe disagreeing with me on that one.
No,
but-
I think you're right. I think there's different components to it. Because we still have the local board and you still have the administrative burden of processing the payroll and processing the retirement pensions and going through disability hearings and all of the administrative of the fund. And there's certainly a lot of risk and liability at the local level, right? Still having that control, not so much here, but in certain communities where maybe those decisions aren't completely
Above board.
Is good. That's great, thank you. But from an investment standpoint, I would say it's still modeled similarly to IMRF from a standpoint of, and that was the whole goal statewide was IMRF is one of the best funded potential funds in the country. Let's model that because it's working. So you each have your own individual accounts. And that's how you're determined to be funded or not, or how high or how low funded you are. So the whole point of that was to still maintain your individuality from that standpoint, because each fund has a very different demographic. We have a very young fund. We have a much higher percentage of tier 1 employees or tier 2 employees than a lot of other funds do. So the funding requirements are different and the makeup of what's needed is different. So there is a lot of benefits to having that individuality maintained. To Jason's point, can you guarantee that it's never going to happen? No, but I also think there's a lot vested in making this work because they know what a mess it was. So, I mean, I guess it's just my opinion. I don't see them raiding our fund, but I would say it's kind of a double-edged sword. Your concerns are valid that they may borrow from funds, but if we don't fund enough, there's statutes that exist that is just going to sweep our state revenues. So the
But we're not talking about
county
that. It's just.
Yeah.
675 or 650.
Right.
But if they don't go to that nuclear option of just
I don't think you would. I think that's where they
one
want to go.
person to pay somebody else.
I don't know
If
that
they don't do that, then our community.
I think legislatively, that would be
We're letting the clock run.
a third rail scenario, because I think communities like us would absolutely go berserk if they exercise that nuclear option.
Yeah.
We would sue the living daylights out of them, because that's not the way it's set up.
Yeah.
And they'd be essentially committing fraud. I mean, there'd be stealing happening based on how it's structured today. They'd have to legislatively amend it. And I'm not, again, I don't think you could ever say it's a 0%.
But it's close to there.
But it's close.
Yeah, because they're like, why hasn't Chicago lobbied and had the
Right.
state, you know, and Pritzker and all that just said, everybody else pay some money over there so that their pensions balance again.
Probably have.
There are, to Jason's point, there are some funds downstate that are they are close to default.
Yeah.
They will default.
Yeah.
I think maybe we'll have to see. What happens when that
Whatever it is, the pension guarantee for public pensions.
No, it's the communities essentially. You know, there's the PBGC, that's the government entity that insures the pensions for private sector employees, and they don't guarantee all of them. But here it's the plan sponsor is the city full pay. Get billing.
Well, I think we should use an interest rate that we think is.
I mean,
Shouldn't this just say rate return assumption? We're not talking interest rate assumption, we're talking about
It should be.
investment rate return assumption.
Yeah.
it's a basic question whether, I mean, if we went from 6.5 to 6.75, that's $175,000. And if everything went swimmingly, the numbers were all right, we would save Glencoe residents more than that in the future.
Yeah, that extra 175,000 that you're putting in is going to earn, you know, is invested in earning, you know, 6.5 or.
Doing that work. So then we, you know, that's the kind of thing, you know, that's why we do infrastructure. You know, so the question is, how do we, you know, can we afford the 175 and sell it to our residents? For those long-term residents like, say, me, we're here for the forever.
Yeah.
It pays off.
And just to be clear, you're already at that, you're at the 650, so it wouldn't be an increase, it's just, you wouldn't be decreasing.
And we've already said, I forget what the statutory requirement was, 1.8 something, and we're at 2. I just don't remember.
Yeah, so
2.3 or
yeah,
something.
2.4,
We're 450 or so over the statutory minimum, and we decided to do that.
And we can always.
Because we're getting out of that.
At the end of the year,
We're going, why-
we're coming up.
Yeah.
It's more than what we did. So. I prefer to stick with what we decided.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Like, so we, so people say, what are we doing about pensions? We say, well, we're paying more now. So the village, we hope, will pay way less over time, and that makes them in
Yeah.
better shape.
yeah, it's like having, it's like having a 15-year mortgage versus a 30-year mortgage. If you look at the payment schedule, you add them all up, you pay a whole lot less under that 15-year mortgage for that same $500,000 house. It's the same concept.
We also had, I don't know how many.
Assuming we don't get screwed.
It's something that's very thing, so then to change it now, I think.
I actually found this very difficult to come back.
Yeah.
On that, that's gonna happen anyway, that'll just fund.
Well, yeah, I mean, we're raising our, we have to raise the 5%, and it's not ridiculous to do it when the CPI looks higher. We're just all freaking out because we got our property tax.
Yeah.
If that were me,
We'll find out.
I'll move into a back room upstairs.
We'll find out. I didn't send it to my tax guy.
I think everyone did that.
But I mean, just to go back, I think we ought to stick with what we planned.
No, I-
We did spend the time on it. And the only reason not to me would be your point or all the point. The likelihood that is pretty low.
We're good.
They're gonna take our money. I just don't think that's what they're gonna do. Because, who's gonna pay? It's gonna be people that are more likely to have money than the people who do not have enough.
Yeah.
Who winds up with the bill, because the state's bankrupt, but for the fact that states aren't allowed to file that, because they didn't. Right,
I think we're getting better.
better than it was.
Yes.
We're less bankrupt
Oh, yeah.
than we were. We have two structural problems. Flat tax, can't mess with pensions.
Yep. And the story.
And federal.
General consensus on here being okay with maintaining. Are we okay with updating maybe some of these minor updates to the mortality table?
So just so we don't have to belabor it. We did just change the mortality table.
Yeah, we did. Yeah, that was part of it. So it's like I said, the table that we had is the same table that we're gonna be using. It's just, there's just different scale that are being, their scale that they adopted is a little bit different. It gets us to the same point. So.
I mean, we talked all.
Yeah, no,
I got to focus on some of the pension funding, you got to focus on mortality table that we talked about.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, so it is the same table, just a minor difference that, like I said, is it lowers the contribution by $7,500. It's basically nothing.
People, actuaries hate it when people aren't dying.
That's true.
It makes past couple of years.
If I help them.
Yeah, well, I work with one fund that, they would average like 40 deaths per year in, 20 to 21, they had like 160 deaths. It was like 4 times as much and a lot of it was COVID related. So it was bad.
By the way, can we forget about the fire?
It's still.
It's one of those.
We're not,
We don't want to hurt that.
we don't-
Yeah,
Year to year.
if the amount doesn't change, you know exactly what we're gonna be.
And we are not consolidating. We've been working with the Consolidated Fire Fund. We are not the only fund like this in the state, which surprised us. There are two other ones. There are three in total that are funding on a year-to-year basis because they're essentially running themselves down. Yes,
And
so.
to Jason's point, her annuity will not increase, it's frozen, so same every year. And it's probably gonna be-
God bless.
It'll be there for a while, but.
But we're just doing it on a pay-as-you-go basis.
So yeah, I would say
Except for the $42,000 a year.
Okay.
48, sorry. That's close.
No question.
Nothing of policy business. But. Not a policy, something.
This is pretty. Home stretch here. So included in your packet is a budget schedule for 2023. We're there already. And this is the first real kind of kickoff discussion, financial policies in August. We'll be kicking off the budget with the departments later this month, actually next week. And then in September, our departments will be entering their budgets. In October, we'll refine kind of the draft budget schedule. We'll review the financial forecast and talk about the levy for the first time. We'll kind of look at the levy draft, and then in November, we'll do a hearing. And then December, we'll adopt the property tax levy along with the whole, overall whole budget package. Any questions or concerns? Okay, it's easy. That concludes my.
I just had one quick question to go back to an earlier item, which is, we talked about the work under the lagoons. Replacing the broken pipes. I think that'll not be completed in November. And hopefully, did they do anything about a temporary repair in the meantime, or did it just shut down?
No, it's checked out. We've decided that's a kind of fruitless effort that we're gonna, all our efforts are focused on. Getting agreement from the Forest Preserve District to move forward.
Okay, all the more reason to make sure we get those new pumps and motors.
Yes. Parallel track down.
Anything else? Thanks.